The video you are about to watch is from an old woodworking magazine that I published during the years of 2003 to approximately 2006. This was a very unique magazine. It was purely video content and it was distributed on DVDs. The magazine ran for approximately 3.5 years, and then due to financial concerns, we simply had to terminate the magazine. We moved on to other things over the last roughly 15 years. However, there has been a request to resurrect this content, so I've gone through the trouble to get the equipment, the products, everything I needed in order to bring this content back to life to share with everyone. Here on this YouTube channel, we'll be putting up approximately 100 to 120 of the original stories that appeared in that magazine. The magazine was called Woodworking at Home Magazine, and it was truly one of a kind in the world. I really hope you enjoy these videos, and please tell your friends about them. What I'm doing is going through and checking the moisture content of the materials that I'm going to be making our CD cabinet out of. Now, I don't want to start out with wood that's too wet. If it's too wet, chances are really good I'm going to get some warpage, twisting, cupping, or perhaps even worse yet, after I get the project completed, it could start splitting and so forth on me. So I want to make sure that I'm starting out with good quality lumber that's dried properly before constructing the project. Now, to begin on this project, we're going to start out by planing all of our material to the proper thickness over here at the thickness planer. Now with the material planed to thickness, what we want to do is make sure we've got a nice straight edge to start with that's also square to the faces. The joiner is the best tool to do that. One area of woodworking that seems to get the least amount of attention, yet yields the best results and doesn't cost you a penny, is laying out your boards and selecting the area on any particular board for each of the components that you want to construct. Now, what I've done here is I've gone through and found the best looking areas on this board. And what I want to do is make the most prominent pieces of this project out of the best looking section of the board. So I've spent literally about an hour and a half here moving things around, laying it out, finding the best looking piece of wood to put that forward, and then the areas that are more hidden, like the inside case divider, the top and bottom of the case unit itself, where they're not real visible, I'll make out of the less appealing pieces of wood. Now this will really improve the overall end result of your project by taking the time now to really study the board and find the best looking pieces or areas on that board. Now at this point, with all my components laid out on my large maple board, what I want to do is start making some rough cuts and getting this down into a more manageable sized piece. Now with the material down to a more manageable size, we can start ripping and cross-cutting each of the pieces to their appropriate size. Now in this section of the board, I'm going to be cutting off my two side panels. Now keep in mind that on the door front, we're going to need about a 1-inch strip that will fold down with the door. But we do want that side strip to match the side of the case. So what I'm going to do is rip this piece to about 6 3/4 inches wide, and then I'll rip off my case side and then the door side piece, and I'll keep these two pieces marked and carefully associated with each other so that during assembly, once we get the door all assembled, these side strips and the case sides will match up very nicely. Now that the boards are narrow enough to cut off here at the compound miter saw, we can go ahead and start cross-cutting each of the pieces to their proper width. And for some of the pieces, it's back to the table saw to be ripped to their proper width. Along the inside face of the two side pieces, we need to cut a series of kerf cuts. Those need to be an 1/8 inch wide by an 1/8 inch deep, and they're very evenly spaced all along there. Now on the drawings, we provided you with the exact dimension for the top edge of each of those grooves, so it makes sense to use the fence as our stopping mechanism. But because we'll be guiding the workpiece with the miter gauge, we don't want to bump directly against the fence, because as we get to this point in the cut, if this should get jammed or cocked at all, it's going to throw it back at us. So rather, you should use a stop block, and I have a 1-inch thick piece of wood clamped to my fence. So as I'm indexing the fence along, I have to make sure I account for that 1-inch block. Now at this point, I've got my 1/8 inch curved saw blade in the table saw, and it's raised up 1/8 of an inch. Now I would like to point out too that on your center divider panel, if you cut it off to the same length as your two side panels, you can use the same indexing all the way along to get the piece kerf cut. Then when you're all done with that operation, you can trim off the top and bottom ends to make it the proper overall length. And that'll just save you an extra step. Once you get about halfway through with your kerf cuts, you may want to move the miter gauge to the other side of the saw blade so that you've got a little better support as you're feeding it through. Now in each of these kerf cuts that we did on the sides and center divider, we need to insert a small little support. And that little support is going to hold up the CDs and DVDs. Now the material I'm using is 1/8 inch thick Baltic birch plywood. And you can pick this up at a variety of different hardwood stores. Now the problem is ripping this stuff. It's only 1/8 inch thick and our piece needs to be 3/8 of an inch wide. Now the material itself is very flexible, and it can be rather unruly as you're feeding it through, and it's generally pretty well warped too, so that creates a few more problems. But as you just saw when I was ripping those pieces, I was doing a hand over hand operation feeding them through with these grippers, and it makes the operation very safe and very stable. Now I'd like to also point out that if your surface finish on your plywood is a little bit rough, which mine was, sand it before you go through and rip all your strips up. It's much easier to sand this big panel than it is to sand 96 of these little itty bitty strips. I don't know about you, but making 96 cuts on this skinny little material doesn't sound like a whole lot of fun one by one. So I've taken and clamped all of mine together and squared up the end by taking a cut here at the bandsaw. I then placed a piece of tape a little less than 5 1/4 inches over from the saw blade, and now I can cut off a whole series all in one pass. Along the back edge of the two side pieces, as well as the case top and bottom, we need to machine a 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch rabbet. Now on the side pieces, we don't want that rabbet to be visible. So we want to make a stop cut. So I've made a mark 1/4 inch in from each end. And that way I can feed the router in, across, and stop at my end mark. Now the top and bottom pieces butt against this area, so we can actually cut all the way through on the top and bottoms. Now I'm using a straight edge guide clamped onto the workpiece to help guide the router along. I'm using 1/4 inch diameter solid carbide router bit, and because it's such a small bit, I'm going to use my little trim router to do this operation. The top and bottom case pieces need to have a dado machined in them. It's approximately 1/2 inch wide. It's in the center of the top and bottom going this way, and it does need to be a stop dado. So I've made a layout mark where I want the dado to stop to, and then did the layouts for where I want to put my edge guides, because I'll be using that same router bit in my trim router that I did for that last operation where we rabbeted the edges. Now what I'll do is I'll feed up to that point, remove the router, shift the guide rail over to the other side, spin the part around, and feed up to that point again. And we can just use a sharp chisel to square up that end. With all the machining done on the sides and center divider, we can start installing the little pieces of wood that serve to hold up our CDs and DVDs. All we need is a little bit of glue in the groove, carefully lining the front edge up so it's nice and flush, and then try to get them in there so that they're perpendicular. To make sure that all four legs are the same length, I decided it's much easier to cut all four of them off before I rip them to their proper width. Now we're ready to rip the legs to their 5/8 inch width. Now remember when you're planing the stock that your leg material is 5/8 of an inch thick. These decorative little dados around the legs are done here at the table saw. I've attached an auxiliary wooden fence to my miter gauge, and then I've set up a stop block. And that way I can pass it over, rotate to piece 90, pass it over, and work my way all the way around the workpiece. To make the feet, I started out by ripping the 5/8 inch thick material, 1 inch wide, and then I cut them off over at the compound miter saw. Now we're ready to start the bevel cut. That'll be at the top front of the foot. And we want that to be at a 45-degree angle, and we want about 1/4 of an inch flat right at the front edge. Because this is such a small part, I find that it's a little bit safer to do these cuts here at the table saw. The legs will be attached to the frame sides using wood screws. Now's the best time to drill those clearance holes for the wood screws because we can gain access to the inside surfaces of the two sides as well as the top, because the frame top is attached to the case top using the same screws, and eventually we'll also be making some spacers for this. So start out by laying out the locations on your side pieces and then drill the clearance holes. Make sure you countersink them deep enough so that as you're sliding your discs in and out of the trays, they don't catch on the heads of the screws. The legs will be held to the feet using 1/4 inch dowel rod. Now I just so happen to have some 1/4 inch walnut dowel rods, so that's what I'll be using, but you could use any dowel for that matter. I've gone through and carefully laid out the locations where I want to drill those 1/4 inch through holes, and they are going to go all the way through because we're going to use the foot as a drilling jig to help drill the legs. I also marked the front and back edges of where each of the legs will be, and that will make that drilling operation go much easier when we transfer the whole location from here into the leg. I've gone through and numbered the bottom of each of my legs, 1 through 4. Then I've made a mark on the foot area, 1 through 4 matching up with the legs, and that way I know I'll keep the leg associated with a particular hole. Now I'm going to take the leg, place it over the hole, line it up with the layout marks that we put on that masking tape, and then we're going to clamp those two pieces together. This is one of those things that's going to take a little bit of messing around. Now with the clamped together pieces in the bench vise, I'll very carefully drill down through the foot into the leg area. Now here's our hole at the bottom of the leg. Now we'll also need another 1/4 inch diameter hole at the top of the leg, and that will be a dowel that we're going to use to join the leg to the frame top. So you can use the same procedure to drill that hole at this time. And now with all the holes drilled on the feet and legs, we can start assembly. Now I've taken those 1/4-inch dowels and cut them off a little bit long at this point. Once I drive them into the legs, I can saw them off flush later. Now what we want to do is transfer our hole locations from our side pieces into the legs. And to do that, there's a simple little jig, we'll call it if you will. I've got a board clamped in my bench vise that's acting as a stop. I've ripped a piece of scrap material that's 1 1/8 wide. And that's the distance from the back edge of our case to the back edge of the back leg. So we can bump that against this stop. Now there's a spacer that I've ripped, or cross-cut rather, to 3 inches wide, and that'll hold the top end of the legs at their proper spacing. Now what we can do is bring our side into place. If we hold everything against the stop over here, things stay pretty well in alignment, as well as square. Now we want to measure 3/8 of an inch down from the top of the leg to the top of the case. With that set, now we can drill these 4 holes. Now I'm using the same size drill as we drilled for our clearance holes, so I don't want to drill deep into the leg, just enough to make a starter spot. And here you can see the little dimple that I made. Now I'll go over to the drill press and drill that to the appropriate depth and for the appropriate diameter of the screws that I'm using, which are number 8 by 1 1/4" wood screws. With a 7/64" drill bit in my drill press and the depth stop set, so I'm drilling about 3/4 the way through the leg, we can pre-drill for those screws. And before assembly, now's a good time to break those sharp edges and deburr all those little slats. The sides and center divider make a very nice holder to hold all these little pieces while we sand them. The sides join to the top and bottom of the case with a simple butt joint. To reinforce that joint, we're going to be using 2 biscuits at each of those locations. Now because the top and bottom stand proud of the front edge of the 2 side pieces, it makes the most sense to do all of your marking and layout for the biscuits off of the back edge. And now we can finally assemble the sides, tops, and bottoms of the case. And a quick check for square, and then we'll let this sit for about an hour or so. And now for a little bit of glue in the dados to receive the center divider, and we can assemble that component. The center divider just gets held in place with some glue. For the back panel, I just used 1/4-inch thick birch plywood. I didn't want to spend a lot of money just getting a piece of maple plywood for the back panel. So I just ripped and cross-cut that to shape, fit it into the opening, and it gets tacked in place with a couple of 1/2-inch brads. Along the 2 sides and front edge of the frame top piece, we need to machine a 1/4-inch by 1/4-inch rabbet. To do that, I'll be using a white side rabbeting bit mounted in my plunge router. Now we can start working on attaching the legs. Now we should already have the holes drilled in the legs and through the sides of the case. Now we need to make these little walnut spacers. They're 3/8 of an inch thick by 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. So I got started at the table saw, ripped some material to 3/8 of an inch thick. Then, using the miter gauge, I cut off each of the pieces to 1/2 of an inch. Then we had to drill a clearance hole, in this case 3/16 of an inch, over at the drill press. And using a small Phillips screwdriver, we can go ahead and attach the legs. And now we can go about attaching the frame top onto the 4 legs. Now I've already got started by first taking the top, placing it upside down on my workbench, centering up the case on the frame top, and then transferring the hole locations down through our pre-existing holes in the case into our frame top. Just use the screw, tighten it up a little bit so I could make a little dimple. Then I went over to the drill press and pre-drilled the holes. Now what we can do is use those screw holes along with screws to help draw the top down tight against our legs. Using dowel centers in our 4 dowel holes, I can transfer those hole locations onto the top. Now with the screws slightly snugged up, I'm going to check everything for center, and then I'll lightly tap down on the top to transfer those hole locations. Now with a 1/4 inch drill bit in the drill press, I'll drill about 2/3 of the way through the thickness of the top. Of course, being very careful not to drill through. Now I'll put a little drop of glue to help hold those dowels in place. I won't be gluing the dowel into the maple top though. We'll just let that float to aid in disassembly for finishing. As you can see on the door panel, there's going to be a tapered walnut section in the center. Now that taper is per side 1/4 inch over the entire length. Now so that the sides also fit up nice, we have to taper the inside edge of the side maple pieces as well. And again, those are 1/4 inch over their total length. Now we've got a real simple setup to show you on that one that makes the process go real easy. It does start out with making sure that all 3 pieces are the same overall length. Now to get that taper, all I'm going to use is a small piece of hardwood that I've cut to 1/4 inch thick, and what I'm going to do is use double-faced tape and fasten it on the edge that'll ride against the fence. And I've already done that with this piece. Now the way this will work, and it will only work with a piece that can start safely in front of the blade and have full contact at the 2 points along the fence, and then as we feed it past the saw blade, we have to maintain those 2 contact points with the fence. As it works out, this board is just the right length to work with my fence. Now on the center piece, we'll have to actually make 2 taper cuts. So we'll do one with the 1/4 inch block on this side. Then when we flip it around to do the other side, we'll need to put 2 1/4 inch blocks there. And they fit up real nice. Now we can go ahead and glue these 3 pieces together before moving on. Just some glue and clamps. Because of the tapers, if we were to just clamp it in this direction, it's probably going to want to slide apart. So by putting a clamp across this way, we restrict that movement. Now we can clamp it up conventionally. Now that the glue's had a chance to dry on the door, I very carefully finish sanded it, both the front and the back, because once we install the handle, it's going to be very difficult to sand along this walnut area next to the maple that's going to serve as the handle. So now what I'm going to do is split the door into 2 pieces. I very carefully measured the distance between this side of the blade and this edge of the workpiece, this side of the blade and this edge of the workpiece, so that I split it perfectly in half. Now here you can see the handle portion put between the 2 front panels. Now what we need to do is rip the handle portion into that triangular piece. And we'll taper it the same way we did before for the walnut and maple pieces. Carefully lay out the hole location and drill it with a 3/16 inch drill bit. You should use a backer board so that you don't get chip out on the back side. Rather than fight with the glue squeeze out after the fact, I've dry assembled everything, clamping it together, and then I've taped up all the areas where I don't want any squeeze out to get. On the back side it won't be a problem because that'll still be flat and we can sand that. The door should be oversized in width and length, so if we don't get things perfectly lined up, we'll be trimming it up to size after the glue's had a chance to dry. Over at the table saw, I've tilted the blade over at 45 degrees and cut the bevels on the sides of the door and the little side pieces. Then I sweetened up the edges over here at the jointer, and now we're ready for some assembly. Now I've already laid everything flat on top of a couple of boards and placed tape behind these two pieces. And tape is actually what I'm going to use to clamp these together. Now with the glue applied, I'm just going to bring these two pieces together like so, and the tape is going to help hold the outside corner good and tight. Now I'm going to throw a couple of clamps across here to hold the sides up nice and parallel. I can't put a lot of clamp pressure on though, because if I do, I'll start folding it in like so. So I'm just going to put clamps on there to help draw that in square. Now with everything flipped back over, I've got my clamps on there, and I'm not going to over tighten them. I don't want to start squishing this in, and then that'll drive the side pieces along that bevel and drive them in and underneath. I just want to draw it up so that it's snug. And along here you can see where that tape is acting almost like a hinge. It wraps completely around the front onto that side piece. So now I'll flip it back over and I'll clean out the glue squeeze out. Now one of the last steps to perform before finishing is to include some form of a catch to hold the door shut as it's closed. Now to do that, what I'm going to be using are some rare earth magnets. The rare earth magnets that I've picked up are 5/16 in diameter and a little bit more than 1/8 of an inch thick. And I'm just going to use one, and I'll drill that with a 5/16 inch drill bit into the top of the case and on the back side of the door itself, so we can put the two opposing magnets together. Now to help with the magnets, I've put the two together as so, and then I mark the two ends. And that way I know that that mark has to go into the hole. Now to help hold them in place, I'm just going to put a little dab of 5-minute epoxy down in there and then press it in. One of my favorite finishes for walnut, cherry, and maple is tung oil. I find that it really brings out the life in all of those woods. It's very easy to apply, and you don't get into very much trouble with it. So I'm going to wipe on a nice wet coat, let it soak in for a few minutes, and then wipe off the excess with a dry rag. I'll probably just apply 3 coats of the tung oil. Now the only real trick to working with tung oil is to wipe it off evenly. You don't want any puddles or wet spots. Get it all wiped off to a nice even dullness. And now you can go ahead and install your piano hinge at the bottom of the door, being very careful to not break off those little brass screws. I would suggest that you purchase some steel screws of the same size and run those in the holes first. And now with the project completed, you can fill it up with your favorite CDs and DVDs. In this case, we got a little bit of Pink Floyd, and of course my favorite DVDs. As you can see, it has plenty of storage for a wide variety of your favorite music titles, as well as a good number of years of Woodworking at Home magazine. Now this completes this project, but I would like to point something out. We're going to be making a much larger media storage cabinet a little bit further down the road, perhaps about midsummer of 2004. So that wraps this project. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home. Thanks for watching. I sincerely hope you enjoyed watching this video. If you truly enjoyed it, please help us share this information with the rest of the communities. Please hit the subscribe button, give us a big thumbs up, and be sure to tell your friends about this channel. Thanks again for watching.